Luther's Quest and England is Best. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is September 14th, 2020. On this date in history, in 1901, William McKinley was shot in Buffalo, New York, in his body by a man who hid the gun in a cast on his arm. He would later die of his wounds. His last words were, "Ah!"
Thanks for tuning back in, everybody. Now we've got to talk about Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, or Frankie Vasquez if you'd like. Remember, Coronado is just where he's from. Now, if you remember on the last episode of Notes, that we talked about Cabeza de Vaca and his slave Esteban. And when they were coming back, they saw up on the horizon a city that looked like it was made of gold. It was just the sun setting behind it. This helped perpetuate this whole story of the 7 cities of Cibola. So Francisco Vasquez had just gotten married to a very wealthy woman, and I think he said something along the lines of, "Would you like to be rich?" And she's like, I already am. "Would you like to be richer?" And she's like, "I guess." And he was like, "Well, give me some money to go on this expedition. I'll find these cities of gold, and you'll have so much money that you won't have diabetes anymore." By the way, that's not part of it, and I don't know if she had diabetes, but I guess if you have enough money, you don't have it anymore. Well, anyway, he goes in search of these 7 cities. They find all these Native Americans, and they ask him where they are, and they tell him they don't know. He thinks they're playing dumb, so he tortures them. Then they tell him, and he goes over to the Grand Canyon. Nothing. Just a big divide in the middle of the land. No golden cities. So he actually drives his wife into bankruptcy. Goes back. Poor Esteban is treated like an idiot because, obviously being black, I don't have a better explanation for it. They just don't treat people really well back then. Unless you're a very wealthy Spanish white person. So if you can be that at that time, that's kind of what you'd want to be if you want to have an easier life. Otherwise, they kind of took advantage of everyone. Anyway, Hernando de Soto, he explored Florida. He also went to the Mississippi River area. He had this weird policy of killing any Native Americans he ran into, and the indigenous people ended up attacking him for some reason, and he died from wounds. The Franciscans. They were formed in 1209. They were celibate monks. They had to give up all their possessions. Basically, you gave up everything and you devoted your life to taking care of the poor. You would eat about once a day during the winter, twice a day during the summer. You had some type of church service or praying that you'd be in for about 8 to 10 hours a day. The rest of the time you were tending the field or actually going out and helping the less fortunate. In 1526, after a few years after Cortez defeated the Aztecs, they were sent to the Americas to protect the natives. And what do they do when they get there? The first thing they did is they destroyed all of the gods of the Native Americans. So they just smashed them if they were made of stone. Way to make a good impression. Catholicism. Now, Catholicism gets adopted by the majority of the people in Central and South America. And one of the ways that they were so successful is they started to incorporate native customs and feasts into the religion for them to have an easier time assimilating. You want a good example of this? Think about Christmas. Now, if any of you are Christian, and if you are, that's great. If you're not, that's great. But the Jesus guy, Jesus was his name, we celebrate his birth with Christmas every year on December 25th. Now, if you want to know when he would have actually been born historically, the census that they talk about surrounding him takes place in March, so he would have been born closer to March 25th than December 25th. But we celebrate December 25th because that's whenever there was this big pagan celebration. It was in the middle of the winter, and you would share your Yule logs. These are basically fire starters, and you would give them to your friends. And that's kind of part of the gift giving and why Christmas is celebrated during that time. So, made it easier to assimilate people. Universities, the first American universities were actually in Mexico City and Lima, Peru. Harvard wasn't founded until 1640, so about 89 years after all of this. So, in the Spanish colonies, they had what was a caste system. If you're familiar with the way that things worked in India, this is how it worked there. Okay, an encomendero was in charge of the village. He had to protect everyone. And they had these forts called presidios that would protect the missions where the monks lived. So at the very top, you have what's called the peninsulares. And these are all the people that are from Spain. They were the most important. Underneath that, you have the Creoles. Okay, the Creoles were Spanish people born in the Americas. Below them, you have the mestizos and mulattoes. These are people that were either part Spanish and part Native American, or part Spanish and part African. At the bottom, you had the labor, and this would be the general population and any slaves. Don Juan de Oñate, he was sent to New Mexico. He goes in 1598. They get to El Paso. They actually celebrated Thanksgiving there, but since they weren't speaking English, we don't recognize that. This happened 22 years before the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth. When he gets to El Paso and they're celebrating, he moves on to New Mexico, and he promised to keep everyone safe, and then he beats everyone. Not by himself, he had other people do it too. So out of all of this, between Cortez and De Soto and several of these other explorers, they create something of a black legend. Basically that the conquistadors and the Spanish only brought horrible things to Latin America, and they didn't bring anything of value, any type of culture. And a lot of Spain's enemies use this to fuel wars against them, or to make it okay to steal from the Spanish. St. Augustine. If anyone asks you what was the first permanent settlement in the Americas, the answer would be St. Augustine. Jamestown was built 42 years later. They built St. Augustine, the fort there, to protect the Spanish lands from pirates. Also in Santa Fe, that's in New Mexico, for anyone who doesn't know, Santa Fe was the first seat of government in the Americas in 1610. Or not in the Americas, but in the United States. So, while in Jamestown they're trying to survive and not eat each other, in Santa Fe they're actually establishing a form of government. So, at the Battle of Acoma, okay, so the Pueblo Indians, and that's what we're going to call all the Native Americans that live in the area, they decide to revolt because they don't want the Spanish to control them, and they are crushed by Spanish forces. Many of the women were enslaved, and all men 25 years old or older had one foot severed. So they overwhelmed the Native Americans, but in truth, they only halfway defeated them. By the way, that joke is saying, they cut off one foot instead of both, so that's defeating someone. Oh. Well, my wife smiled, and maybe it's because she likes me, or maybe she found it amusing. The Pueblo Revolt, or Pope's Rebellion. Uh, after I guess people grew back their feet, or enough of the population, uh, grew up with 2 feet, the Pueblo Indians revolted under a man by the name of Pope. He was not the Pope, he was a man named Pope. And they pushed out the Spanish for 50 years. On an odd note, the Pueblo Indians, or all the Native Americans that lived in the area, they were always at war because they could never communicate, find peaceful terms. Well, when the Spanish took over, they forced them all to learn Spanish, and that helped them to unite to overthrow the Spanish. The Great Plains Indians. Notice this is Plains and not Planes. So this is not airplanes. They thrived after the horse was brought to the area, and they were able to keep their culture for about 300 years. And they would use the horses to hunt buffalo, and they used every single part of the buffalo for something. They used bones for tools. They used their skins for clothes and shelter. And I guess if you were ugly, you might use some of the buffalo skins to hide your hideousness. Uh, and then they would eat large amounts of the buffalo also. I don't know if they did with the blood. I don't know. Maybe it was a good hair gel. I'm going to probably stop there because... So, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a monk. And if you look at the image of him, you'll see that he was probably not doing everything for the people he could. I mean, look at the size of him. He was massive. He may have given away all his possessions, but I don't think he counted food in that, if you know what I mean. He had several problems with the way that the Catholic Church was operating. So he wrote all these down in what was called the 95 Theses, or 95 Problems with the Catholic Church. He nailed it up on the church door, and so that everyone in town could see it. He was not the first person to do this. Now, normally what happened whenever you would have any problems with the church, they would wait until later on that evening, grab you, and then violently murder you and anyone who supported you. The problem at this time was the fact that the king of the Holy Roman Empire, which is where Germany is today, the king of that, who was also the king of Spain, he was fighting the Muslims and trying to keep them out of Europe. So instead of being able to kill Martin Luther, he didn't. He didn't have time. Martin Luther really starts what's the Protestant Reformation. He said good works weren't enough to get into heaven. He also said no indulgences, and he believed that everyone should read the Bible. Also, his supporters, since the Catholic Church was no longer in charge, if you were a king and you supported him, then you could personally take all the land away from the church. So all these different kings that wanted more land basically hid Martin Luther until most of this blew over and it was too late to stop what he was doing. At about the same time, John Calvin starts a religion called Calvinism and predestination. Predestination is the belief that God knew if you were going to go to heaven or hell before you were born, and so then nothing you did in life mattered because everything was determined before you were born. The church here was led by a group of elders, and the reason we're talking about church, mainly is because it sets some of the foundation for what people are doing over here in the Americas. And not only that, in a Calvinistic church, they have the elders run the church, and it's not done by the pastor. The elders are normally elected by the congregation, and so this is more of a representative body like the type of government we have, where we have Congress that's elected by the people who help run the government for the people. So the changes in the church kind of mirror what happens with society as well, and kind of the foundations of democracy. Uh, the Dutch, the Dutch actually have a very strong trading power. They're very strong trading power for about 100 years. They took over the Molucca Islands, and this is where you get all the spices that you love, your cinnamon, your nutmeg, your salt and pepper, all of those things. They also attacked the Spanish. Now, to control their trading empire, they had two groups. One was called the Dutch East India Company, and they were in charge of the Molucca Islands, the Gold Coast of West Africa, India, and Taiwan. So basically, Africa and Asia falls under the Dutch East India Company. The West India Company, this is basically North America, the Caribbean. One of their explorers, Henry Hudson, uh, he goes up to Canada, finds this really big bay, claims it for the Dutch. Then he goes down to New York, and the Hudson River is named after him also. New France. It was founded for the fur trade. Uh, while the Spanish were going in murdering people, taking over, eventually marrying the people, and creating a new group and a new leadership. New France, the main thing they were trying to do was trade. A lot of a lot of explorers from France come over to the Americas, mainly because of the shortage of women. At this point in France, there were basically 2.1 men for every woman. So, you might really like your best friend Frank, but you might also be hoping that he dies so you can have his wife. But there were several women over in the Americas, and that's one of the things that they came over for, was women. Uh, Also, they sent over priests to try and convert the people as well. Uh, they didn't force government. They didn't do a lot to fight the Native Americans. In fact, they were pretty much the nicest explorers. Uh, you also have a lot of people from France coming over to the Americas as indentured servants, where they would agree to work for free for 5 to 7 years, and then they would get something from whoever paid for their passage and their freedom. Giovanni de Verrazzano, he mapped the east coast of North America north of South Dakota. And if you think that's weird, it's very complicated to make that sentence. Jacques Cartier, in the 1540s, he went looking for a northwest passage. He found the St. Lawrence River, and he started Montreal, which was the first colony of New France. Uh, by the way, just so you know, the Northwest Passage is a passage where you can go through. If you go far enough north, you can go all the way through the water to get to Asia. But the problem was none of the ships at the time were powerful enough to fight their way through, and no ships actually made through the Northwest Passage until 1905. It's not the best way to go. It's probably more convenient to go around the tip of South America, or have someone build a canal through Panama, or maybe even Nicaragua. Samuel de Champlain, he was the father of New France. He started Quebec for the fur trade, and he ended up taking away the Dutch lands from the Dutch, and he built a lot of forces to try and control this area of New France. If you look on the right, you will see Mr. Dugdale and a young Zachary Dugdale. Zachary is my youngest son. There we are next to a statue of Samuel de Champlain in Calais, Maine. Calais, Maine is right across the river from where he went. It was said that Champlain landed there, and I went there with my youngest son in 2008. Actually, I'm lying, it was 2009. You will believe anything. Anyway, Robert Sieur de la Salle, that's him on the left-hand side, he explored the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. His men kept begging for him to let them go back, and he kept saying no. So then they accidentally killed him when they stabbed him 8 times. However, the fact that he made it down to the end of the Mississippi River meant that they had a claim to all of Louisiana territory, a territory that was about half the size of the United States in 1803. Anyway, the Spanish colonies. They ignored most of the southwestern United States because there wasn't much gold and silver. They didn't really trade or manufacture anything. All they were trying to do was take all the gold and silver out of the land. They brought over a type of government that basically mirrored what was in Spain. The encomienda system had one person at the top and several people in the form of a pyramid beneath, just like you did in Spain. The French colonies, they were very sparsely populated. They traded with the natives, didn't steal their land. Sometimes they would trade for land, but that was about it. There were only about 80,000 French colonists, and that was compared to the 1.5 million English colonists. Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne settled Louisiana, and he would later become the father of Louisiana. That's him on the left-hand side. He looked a lot like my great-grandmother, and his wig kind of looked like her hair. It's possible that maybe Jean-Baptiste is my great-grandmother. England. England was founded in 1066 by William of Normandy. William of Normandy was a Frenchman who went into England and conquered it, showing that even once every 1,000 years, a Frenchman can do something great. In 1215, a bunch of rich people uh, surrounded the king, put swords to his throat, and demanded that he give equal rights to the nobility. And the king agreed, so he would be violently murdered. So this is a foundation of giving privileges beyond just the king. Around the 12th century is whenever you see the start of common law in England. Okay, they started royal courts, and judges started to decide the fairness of items. You're probably most familiar with hearing things like common law marriage, where if you live with someone long enough, even if you didn't get married, then they have certain rights, and you could have to get divorced from someone that you never married. I know several people that have done that. In fact, my wife had a father who had to get divorced from someone he lived with. So, but I won't mention which father it was. It was hers. Her father. Her father was not a her. That's a different story. So the Reformation in England. Now, despite what you may think about Martin Luther, I think Martin Luther did have certain things in mind and did have strong beliefs. Now you come to Henry VIII. At one point, Henry VIII sent troops down to protect the Pope, and the Pope called him the defender of the faith. Now, Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, if you remember that story. Her nephew was King Charles V of Spain. So Mary and Henry VIII had a baby. It was a daughter. Her name was Mary. Then we all get to see how evil Catherine really was. She intentionally had 6 miscarriages. And every one of the sons that she tried to provide Henry with didn't make it. By the way, he thought it was intentional. I can't give you any proof that it was intentional or that you could. I mean, I guess you could, but anyway. So during that time, you couldn't get divorced, but you could have the Pope annul your marriage if you had not made relations physically with your spouse. Henry claimed that, but his nephew Charles V, who had an army in Rome, told him no. So Henry does what any normal man would do, and he decides to create his own church where they allow divorce. So the Archbishop there of Canterbury was put in charge of the church under the king, and he had his marriage annulled. So Henry then marries Anne Boleyn. She's like, hey, if you marry me, I'll totally give you a son. Oh, oh, oh. Exactly like that. He was like, wow, your voice is attractive. And she had a daughter named Elizabeth, so he went to get her hair cut, and they accidentally violently took off her entire head. So then he got married 4 more times. He married Jane Seymour. She lived a year, and then she died. Married Anna Cleves. And then she died. Then he married Catherine Howard, and then he had her executed. Then finally he marries Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr has a sickly child with him, and then he would violently die. Actually, he died peacefully in his sleep. So, the Act of Supremacy puts Henry VIII in charge of the Catholic Church, or what's called the Anglican Church. And just like in Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, Henry takes all the land from the church, and it now belongs to him and some of his nobles, so they would accept it. So after Henry VIII dies, Edward VI becomes a king. He was a very sickly child. The church officials tried to make the Anglican Church more Protestant. They let their priest marry, and they tried to make a new type of church service. But then Edward VI just dies. Then Mary comes to the throne. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, and when she comes to the throne, the first thing she does is she wants to make England Catholic again. So any of the supporters of Henry VIII or the new Anglican Church were executed. And she had about 300 of these people burned at the stakes. Okay? So, at that time, Elizabeth I, this would be the daughter with Anne Boleyn, it was said that she was illegitimate. And so the rich people said, hey, if you decide you want to be queen, we'll make sure that you're no longer illegitimate, and then you're in charge of the country. So she's legitimized by the Act of Succession, and she supports that the priests can get married. They decide to get rid of all the saints in the church, and she never got married. She was known as the Virgin Queen. They called her reign the Golden Age. She ruled from 1558 to 1603. Uh, so Charles and his son, Philip II, did not care for Elizabeth, so eventually they try and replace her with their cousin and her cousin through marriage, Mary, Queen of Scots. There's a show on the CW about this. Sorry to ruin it, but Mary was beheaded. So Spain, in an attempt to overthrow her, sent 130 ships to England. The English sent out all their ships to try and stop them, and between the English ships and the equivalent of a hurricane on the water, the Spanish were defeated. And from that point, really until about the 1930s, England has the most powerful navy in the world. And now we come to yet another end of our notes. I hope everyone has a nice day. I hope everyone stays safe. And I will see you on the same channel in 2 days.